Welcome you all. I appreciate you. I'm so sorry how I was there. Just so excited about for the South Dakota Humanities Council and how important these people are and these sponsors and everyone and how important the donations are. It just is amazing to me all that the South Dakota Humanities does for the promotion of so many things for our state and region. So I just appreciate all of you that have donated and will continue to donate in the future. And so, and remember then too, with your donations, where you have the chance to enter that drawing for the print of our festival guide cover image. So, once again, we couldn't. The festival would not be possible without the generous support of all those donors. And now today we're here then for the Giants in the Earth, a Centennial Appreciation. And I want to introduce uh, Deidre McDonald Berzer. She is the director and editor-in-chief of the South Dakota Historical Society Press. She is currently writing an intellectual biography of Rose Wilder Lane, a brief version of which appears as a chapter in the Essential Women of Liberty. Berzer's book reviews have appeared in numerous publications, and I am impressed how she is a frequent guest on National Review's The Great Books podcast. So let's welcome Deidre, who will continue with our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will have them entertain some questions, and then we'll turn over question asking to you all. So you can start jotting down what you want to ask. All right. At the end of the table here is Jennifer Tysinger. She joined the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra as executive director in 2019. Under her leadership, the SDSO received the 3 largest donations in the organization's history and has seen unprecedented national recognition with articles in the New Yorker and the Washington Post. Her collaborative partnership with music director, sitting next to her, Delta David Geyer, has resulted in 9 world premieres to date. Together, they have expanded the symphony's education and engagement programming by growing community partnerships and have grown the Lakota Music Project and Music Composition Academies. All right, and then next to her is Delta David Geyer, who is in his 21st season as the music director of the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra. He has directed most major orchestras in the United States and has worked extensively with orchestras across Central and South America, Europe, and Asia. He has received national recognition as an advocate for both contemporary classical music and the role of local arts organizations in intercultural community building. In 2012, he was selected for ASCAP's John S. Edwards Award for Strongest Commitment to New American Music. And in 2022, he received the Ditson Conductors Award for the Advancement of American Music. Next, we have Cameron Miller, who is the Education Associate at the Center for Western Studies, located on the campus of Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Cameron graduated from Augustana in 2018 with a degree in history. In her current role, she is responsible for managing all public programming initiatives at the center, including the renowned Dakota Conference, which focuses on regional history and culture. Cameron's work supports the center's mission of preserving and promoting the history of the Northern Plains region. And next to me is Alan Carlson. Alan received his PhD from Ohio University, studying modern European history. He has taught at Hillsdale College, Gettysburg College, and Catholic University of America. He has written 17 books, including Land and Liberty, The Best Essays of Free America, The New Agrarian Mind, and most recently, the new introduction and annotations to South Dakota Historical Society Press's Hot Off Press reprint of Giants in the Earth, which I'm going to wave at you. And so we're going to start off here with Alan and David, and they can decide who goes first. How did you first come across Giants in the Earth, and how has it stayed with you, or maybe not stayed with you since then? And then how has your understanding of the work changed or deepened over time? And I've just given you like a huge paragraph to kind of remember.
You go, Alan.
Okay.
Fair enough. I attended Augustana College, not to be confused with Augustana University. Um, this was the Swedish version down in Rock Island, Illinois. But that's where I was introduced to the book Giants in the Earth. One of my favorite professors there in the English department was Roald Tweet. Tweet is a good Norwegian name. Roald is another good Norwegian name. And he was a Norwegian and a Swedish sea down there. But in his class in American literature, he had us read Giants in the Earth and discuss it. And I was fascinated by the book. I've reread it several times over the years. And then Deidre invited me to write the introduction and do some new annotations. It was just a bit of thrill to be part of that project. What has what has changed a little bit is that in some ways this saga of the prairie, which is its subtitle, has taken a real life in my own existence. Uh, I now reside on the farm that my wife's family moved to in 1950. It's in northern Illinois. And one of the projects we've been doing in recent decades is restoring 15 acres to a tall grass prairie. And it's you know you it's been a lot of work, but it's been a lot of fun. And what I've come to appreciate is the beauty and wonder and pageantry of the prairie itself, which of course I think is one of the major themes in Giants in the Earth, is the extraordinary wonder of the prairie, the danger of the prairie, uh, the relationship between the prairie and human beings. This year, our prairie has had a wonderful year. We did a controlled burn, and in June and early July, the flowers popped out. The blazing stars, the coneflowers, the black-eyed Susans. It's just a remarkable display of color. Pictures can't even capture it, can't even begin to capture it. And then starting in August up until now, the grasses come, the tall grasses, the big blue strip, the dropseed, the wild rye. Uh, and again, we have paths for the prairie. They're a tunnel now, and you can kind of appreciate what that had to be like when it was, as they say, a virgin prairie. It had not been untouched by the human plow. Um, so that's, I think, one way in which my appreciation of the book has personally been deepened. I love the prairie, but I've also learned to understand the depth of the prairie, and particularly the reconfiguration of the prairie and in the book. I mean, Norwegians were mountain people. They lived on fjords and on mountains. What were they doing in flatland? How'd they ever get there? But there they were. And what Rovog does quite beautifully is he transforms the image of the prairie into that of the sea. He himself was a fisherman up in the Arctic, up at the Arctic Sea. That's for the first 7 years of his adult life. And so refashioning the prairie as a ocean, as a sea, as again one of the brilliant parts of the book.
My first contact with this came through Art Husebo, the founder of the Center for Western Studies on the campus of Augustana University. My first night in Sioux Falls, 21 years ago, as a candidate, I had a dinner in Mary Summervold's home, and Art and Doris Husebo were there. And Art, once I got the job, he handed me a copy of Giants and said, if you want to understand people here, you need to read this book. And then he said, and there's an opera. And I thought, oh, great, there's an opera. And it was several years later after Art had passed that I finally got around to reading the book. And then a little research found out that not only was it an opera, it was by Douglas Moore, who was a very prominent American opera composer in the mid 20th century. Ballad of Baby Doe was his biggest opera, which was very often performed, 50 years ago or so. But it also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1951 when it was performed at Columbia University. It was only performed once again in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1970s sometime, kind of a tree falling in the woods. But the piece had never been recorded. Like nobody's heard this opera by a very prominent American composer. So for me, as music director of the South Dakota Symphony, it was kind of like finding a diamond on the side of the road. Like what better orchestra to revive this opera and record it than the South Dakota Symphony? Um, since then, how it's changed. I mean, I did appreciate reading the novel, um, and I've also read the other two books. It's Giants is the first in a trilogy. Pedro Victorious and Their Father's God being the other two, and it's a remarkable study of immigration to the United States. I understand 100 years ago it was required reading in East Coast prep schools because it was the American immigrant story. Um, but particularly you get to the second book, which is more about that second generation and the first generation, Barrett's home being the representative there, fighting against, her sons wanting to not be Norwegian, wanting to be American, wanting to leave it behind, and Barrett trying to hold on, and then throughout the third book and the prejudices against, against people, it was really just really well done, fascinating. And lastly, I will say where this journey has taken me has been to exploring a more nuanced history of the state of South Dakota, particularly with regards to our relationship with Native Americans. Um, the Dakota are not featured very prominently in any of the books. Only basically one scene in the first book, which is not a bad scene, but it made me, begin to explore. Actually, just this last week with one Lakota, one Dakota person, what was that actual relationship between Norwegians and the Native Americans? Because it wasn't the same as Custer. It was the U.S. government had a different kind of relationships than these homesteaders that came here to escape poverty and to build a new life. It was not, it's not as black and white as it seems. So that's my journey with this.
Thank you both for that. Very fascinating. I think this is probably a good time to kind of segue a little bit into thinking about why or what aspects of this story, and we call it it's the subtitle is a saga of the prairie, but we often call it an epic, right? And deciding to name something an epic certainly has its own. Um, oh, things are coming our way. Okay, so calling something an epic puts it in a category.
You want us to use these now? We can still.
Mm.
So I wasn't sure what this was about.
Great. Happy to help.
Yeah.
We'll take a short break while we change technology.
No, we're,
Okay, so do I
I talked to the organizers out
turn
there.
this off?
No, use the handhelds now. Yep, sorry about that.
Well, our short break is now over. All right. So I was saying that what aspects of we've decided over time that this is indeed an epic story, and I think there are some aspects of being an epic story. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what makes an epic, but what is it that makes it a great opera? Like what parts of the story come up, and then also I'm going to make Cameron talk here. Cameron's here as a representative of the Center for Western Studies. They're hosting a conference around the time that the opera is being performed. And if anybody doesn't know, because I didn't make that explicit, South Dakota Symphony Orchestra is performing the opera at the end of April. Is it the 25th, 26th, and 27th? Get your tickets now. And the Center for Western Studies will be hosting their Dakota conference that weekend, right after that, right before, that will engage with ideas about immigration including Giants in the Earth. So, and then we did the book at South Dakota Historical Society Press in conjunction with the opera to try to work together to increase understanding of the novel, access to the novel, and also just to gear up some excitement for people to go to the opera. So, to circle back, what is it about this story that makes it so compelling to translate into an opera, to translate into a conference? And I'll throw that to anyone who wants to entertain that question.
It's your turn, Cameron.
All right. Well,
It's your turn, Cameron.
um, super fun to be here. As the education associate at the center, it's fun for me to get out and be able to promote our event. And so, of course, this spring, right before the symphony, we will be having our Dakota conference, which will be Thursday and Friday, the 24th and 25th of April, right on campus at Augustana at the Center for Western Studies. Of course, we have been in discussions about how we can work together to celebrate this novel. And also, something that is interesting to note is in 2025, it's the bicentennial of Norwegian immigration to the United States. And so it's sort of a perfect storm for being able to revisit these topics. And specifically, the Dakota Conference is going to be focusing, or our theme for the conference is settling and resettling of the plains. And so we invite presenters to submit papers on that topic. But it's also a great opportunity for anyone who's interested in hearing from historians on that topic to come to the conference and hear people present on their research. So it'll be good to partner and kind of have a 4-day event to celebrate the novel. Yeah, I invite everyone to come.
So I told Cameron earlier I was going to ask her these questions, and we'll get back to the epic thing. But while she has the microphone, so to speak, one of the things that makes Augustana a very good location for Rolvog discussions is the presence of historical structures related to him.
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with Heritage Park that sat on the campus of Augustana for many years. Up until recently, a few of the buildings have since been relocated. Two of the buildings have been relocated south of Sioux Falls to the Apple Orchard. I forget specifically the name, but the church and the house have been relocated. And then the writing cabin actually still is on Augustana's campus and is being renovated in the future, will be renovated, and will be used by Augustana faculty and students for writing purposes. So it's kind of fun to maintain that on Augustana's campus and sort of continue that legacy. So I know that I was telling her I've already been asked that question a couple times here at the conference, what the status of those buildings are. So
thank you for that, Cameron. So I'm going to circle back. Maybe Jennifer and David and Alan have some things to add to the discussion about what are the compelling aspects of this story and Giants that make it opera worthy.
Well, it's dramatic. The story's dramatic, epic, whatever you want to call it, whatever adjective you want to use. It's tragic, and lots of opera is tragic. There's a lot of death, and there's not a lot of, illicit sex in Giants in the Earth like there is in other operas. But, we got the death part covered. So that makes it opera worthy in some respects.
Spoiler alert.
But yeah, so well, I think from my perspective, the important thing is to understand a bit about Douglas Moore. He was actually very prominent, not just as a composer, but also as an advocate for American music and American culture. He taught at Columbia University. He was part of that New York circle with Leonard Bernstein and many others, in the mid 20th century. And all of his work was about Americana, everything that he did. His operas, his symphonic works, his chamber music all had American themes because he was a big proponent of an American culture sort of in up against the huge wave of European composers, European conductors, soloists like this. He really wanted to see Americans come into their own. So that made Giants worthy to him of a subject matter to take seriously. Um, what makes it a great opera? We'll find out in a few months because I have an archival recording from the premiere, and it is abysmal. I mean, it is a miracle that this opera won the Pulitzer Prize, because whoever went to hear this, I mean, it's a skeleton orchestra. The singers are okay. In the recording, you can hardly hear the orchestra at all. So, oh my gosh, but I can see the score. I have the scores. I look at it. I see it's really quite masterful. And the Pulitzer Committee gave it like really a rave in terms of, rarely has an American composer, I forget exactly the quote, tapped into, you know, something. Um, so I'm really excited about it. We've got all of the singers. We auditioned over 100 singers in New York for this, and we got our top pick of all 10 members of the cast, and we a wonderful stage director. It's really great. So I'm going to pass over to Jen because we have a lot of really great partners in this. So Jen, you want to talk about what's that's lined up to be?
So, Giants in the Earth has been in discussion at the South Dakota Symphony for several years. David mentioned it to me soon after I came on board. And what's remarkable about it is that it's an exciting project for so many organizations throughout South Dakota and beyond. And that starts with South Dakota Historical Society and South Dakota Historical Press, who jumped on board, a couple years ago? And said we would love to be a part of this. And now we have Alan Carlson's annotated version of the book. Center for Western Studies. I think we had discussions with Harry Thompson, sometime last year. And now we see, your Dakota conference, being centered around immigration to South Dakota. We have established partnerships with Norway House, with Norwegian American Historical Society in Minneapolis, Scandinavia House in New York. So we even had lunch with the Norwegian ambassador when she was in town over the summer, talking about Giants in the Earth. And we now have a relationship with the Norwegian embassy in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of enthusiasm about this. And I'll let you in on a secret. Serendipitously, the opera production in April of 2025 coincides with the 100th anniversary of publishing the book and the 200th anniversary of Norwegian immigration to the United States. We didn't plan it. We're owning it. But in many ways, Alan's annotated version of the book, the opera, the Dakota Conference, it was all meant to be right now. So thank you, Ollie Rolvag and Douglas Moore, because it's bringing many organizations together. Yeah.
Well, just one more thing, or a few more things about why this is an epic work. First of all, that's what Rolvag wanted. He was a voracious reader of the Old Norse sagas, and he recast his book. He gave a number of speeches on the book and the book's content. All were called Vikings of the Western Prairie, and he meant that quite seriously. The Viking spirit had been reborn. And in some ways, some remarkable things were happening in the Norwegian migration. Between like 1825 and 1925, half of Norway's population made the remarkable step of leaving the old country, crossing the ocean, and settling in the upper Midwest. It's an amazing story. No other nation saw that happen at the time, except for Ireland, but there it was death and starvation from the potato famine. So it's a remarkable story in and of itself. And Rovag tried, and sometimes quite successfully, to explain just the sheer majesty of the project. Um, Another thing that I think makes it remarkable, which uh, has been mentioned before, is it's a story, it's an immigrant story that's true for all immigrants in some ways. And particularly as the second and third volumes played out, the struggles, what's going to happen to the second and third generations. Uh, what does integration into American life mean? Rovag was a committed cultural pluralist. By that he meant he was he firmly opposed the concept, for example, of an Anglo-American conformity. He firmly opposed the concept of a melting pot, where all the ethnicities would be thrown into a giant pot and melted together into something new. He believed in a democracy of peoples, a democracy of ethnicities, a multilingual society was in fact, his dream. He wanted to see America as a land of all races, of all religions. He said that a number of times. And it's a dream that we didn't quite work out here. And I talk about that to some degree in the introduction. There was efforts to suppress that concept and that idea. But I think it's alive again. And in the United States today, we are, in some ways, at the national level, we're sort of a bilingual society. Spanish is sort of almost a second language, somewhat official. But at the next level down, there are hundreds of ethnic groups in the United States still speaking their languages, and Rovag would applaud that and defend them, and in fact, encourage them to keep that up. For him, the ideal Americans, he said this a number of times, were the Jews. He said they have learned how to succeed in places wherever they have gone, but they've also held on to their language, and they've also held on to their customs and ways and their faith. He said that's what every ethnic group should do. Now, you might disagree with that, but I think, again, it's a vision of a way of life that I find quite compelling. And again, I think the book captures many elements of that, which again adds to its epic quality.
So that's a really great segue into a question I have about the opera. And does it pick up on those strands of cultural pluralism and ways that that it will address more modern questions about immigration and all of us living together, not in the melting pot?
No, it does not. I mean, it's an opera, which means like, all of us, I'm sure, have had the experience of going to see a movie of a beloved novel and seeing, it butchered on the screen. Like, oh, well, they left this out or that out or this, and this is going to be very much that.
That's a lot to cover in an
Right.
opera.
Right. And some significant things are changed. Like, at the end of the novel, it's like Hare is going out to aid his friend Hans Olsa. But in the opera, it's the baby that's dying, and Pear goes out. I mean, what does stay consistent is that Barrett guilts Pear into leaving and going out and committing suicide. That's the same. So, um, but so, but it's really the opera. It's an opera. It's really about interhuman interaction. There's conflict. There's a fight with the Irishman who, over the stakes in the ground and that sort of thing. A fleeting reference to an Indian bone that's found. That's it as far as that go. But the thing that I'm really impressed with is Douglas Moore's ability to humanize and to bring relationships um, to the fore, particularly the relationship between Pear and Barrett, that central couple. He does a marvelous job. I mean, there's serious conflict between these two. Pear is like, I'm going forward, I'm conquering, da. Barrett's like, no, I'm looking back. I want to hold on to what's that. You're totally wrong. But they love each other, and that's really very, very clear. It's clear in the book how much they love each other, and Douglas Moore did a beautiful job translating that.
Do you have a sense of how Douglas Moore was introduced to the novel? Do you think it was part of because it was a required reading, maybe when he was a
I
student? I'm just,
I read
you know.
about it more.
No.
I don't remember. Good news is that his biographer is part of the project. I
Oh,
think he's going
that's
to
great.
he's writing the program notes. We
Oh,
expect
wonderful.
him to be in Sioux
Yes.
Falls for the premiere. So, uh, answer is forthcoming.
I'm going to make sure that Jerry McBride, Douglas Moore's biographer, adds that how he learned right about giants in the earth. I'll make sure he writes about that in the program notes. Yes,
Good.
that's a great question.
Right.
That is.
So we do know that it was required reading. If South Dakota friends who are in their 80s have talked about their own friends from Virginia and Maryland and other East Coast places who did have required reading. And so it poses a question, um, what kinds of required reading might help us to understand, or maybe watching opera? And I kind of think that, my own teenagers and 20 something kids love Hamilton, for example. And I think they've gained somewhat of a perspective of American Revolution and early Republic from that. And so there are different ways into telling these stories, and maybe we haven't been having these immigration novels that focus on cultural pluralism, but coming back around to that and might perhaps be of some assistance in this new situation that's not so new in America today.
Well, so I'm going to I'll give a brief answer to that, but I wanted to pass it off to you, Alan, about that. The danger in presenting this opera as is in my mind is presentism. Like, because you have to take the novel for the time in which it was written and the culture in which it was written, and for people today to read it, it can seem bigoted. Like, and we're trying to meet this head on because we're the orchestra that does the Lakota Music Project. We side by side with Lakota and Dakota musicians to address racial prejudice. And here we're presenting this opera, and within the first 20 minutes of the opera, you've got Per and Hans Olsa. Per is saying, "Hey, you got a piece of land for me?" Hans Olsa says, "Yeah, all you got to do is put your stake in the land and it's yours." "What? It's mine?" Like, I mean, it's a little gross, honestly, you know? So we're trying to get out ahead of that story, because I think for a lot of people today, it was a reality at the time, and it was done a lot out of ignorance. I don't know what you think, Alan. I mean, what's your take on that?
I think you're right. It's a challenge you have to face. I was pondering that a little bit, but it sounds like you're facing it square. We have to remember these were peasant boys. He's a fisherman. He had a 9-week education for 6 years in Norway. That's all he had. He certainly knew nothing about the realities of America. What he knew was what came back from the America letters, which talked about a land of wide open land. Anybody could just come and take it. It's just there to take. Uh, and nothing, I'm sure nothing was said that there had been owners there not too long ago, or at least tribes that claimed that territory. And they didn't know that. And so they get here. There's some vague references, like you say in the novel, to Indians, fairly gentle. And at one point, Per Hansen starts trading with the Indians and works out a pretty good deal. That's one of his big achievements early on. But I think you're right. That's a major challenge. The uh, concept of cultural pluralism, well, actually, that's a whole separate panel discussion. But again, I think it's revived right now. Major figures, Jane Addams, Randolph Bourne, intellectual from the 1920s, Horace Collett, the Jewish historian from Harvard, are the great proponents. But all of them were their predecessor, or at least their common figure, was Rolvog. He wrote a book on our heritage where he describes what this future would look like. And again, I think, unlike almost every other writer of the time that I can think of, Rolvog faced that issue too. And I think you'd probably, in your somewhere in your notes or in your introduction, I think he needs to be credited for that. He was he wanted to see a land of kind of a United Nations in the United States. And he thought it was possible, but also desirable. And I think he deserves credit for that.
And I think that's a great place to turn over questions to our audience. If anyone would like to have a question, you could address it to one member of the panel or the entire panel to you. And I think, yes, Rita's got a microphone down there. So if you make your way to the front, or she can bring it to you, the roaming microphone.
You can have mine.
In the meantime, when
No, they were moved to Augustana's campus. Oh, she asked if the buildings that were on Augustana's campus is where yeah, was settled, moved. Yeah. No, it was and I believe it was near Hill City, Minnesota. Or Beaver Creek, is that right, Patrick? Yes. Okay. That's originally where they were from, and then they were moved to Heritage Park on Augustana's campus.
just yell.
How much in the book they talk about what the Norwegian immigrants were told in the home country about what the sales pitch there, and how much did we learn about what they were told, what they expected, and the difference between what they expected.
Repeat the question.
The question was, how much were the Norwegian immigrants told about what America was like, what it was going to be like, and what did they find when they got here, and what they were going to get?
Sales.
Okay. Well, the sales pitch originally was it's a land of it's a place where you can get land free and cheap. It's good land. It's virgin land, great soil. Uh, there were no encumbrances. Uh, People back in Norway were tied in, for example, inheritance patterns tied families very closely, kept younger siblings of peasant families from owning land. It wasn't possible for them to own land, or very or nearly impossible, very expensive. Uh, and so it's a great place to have a landed future. And your children could also claim land. And for about 50 years, again, putting aside where the land came from, but for 50 years that was true. The Homestead Act of 1862, which is featured in this book, uh, you could claim 160 acres of surveyed vacant land, quote unquote, and pay $18 a registration fee. You settle on the land, build a house, and raise some crops on it for 5 years. You got it. It's free. I mean, it's pretty close to free land. And that was true. Now, the further west that moved, 160 acres wasn't quite enough to make the farm productive or profitable, I guess. But the area where they were settling in the eastern part of the Dakota Territory, that was plenty at the time, given the technology of the time. And the soil was wonderful. So they found some good things. I mean, they really did. What they didn't quite understand was that the winters were pretty dark and pretty bleak. Uh, and 10 feet of snow was not common, but it happens fairly frequently. And the wind, they weren't prepared for the wind that they found. So they found there were some geographic characteristics of the territory which were challenging, and they're all beautifully discussed in the book in Rolvag's telling. What they also were not told is where the land had come from. They didn't know little, if anything. Well, the Indians had been driven off, but that's maybe all they knew. And they just sort of accepted that. Rovag is interesting. He had very little contact with African Americans. Again, there weren't many up in Minnesota at the time, except near the end of his life when he had a heart ailment and he died relatively young in 1931 when the heart ailment finally caught up with him. But for the last 2 years, he spent about half of each year down in Mississippi, in Biloxi. He was sent down there. They said it was a good place uh, to avoid the Midwestern winter, go down to Mississippi. And he left some notes about his observations down there. It was the first time he spent any time with Black people, and he liked them. Uh, it's nothing that you would publish because it was just random thoughts. He also wrote down what Southern whites told him, and he said it just didn't ring true with what his experience was. So, but he was what he knew was what most immigrants from Northern Europe at the time knew: free land, uh, and a great place, a great opportunity to start a farm.
Stuff like that. But we think it
About what would the what? Oh,
Just
top, but not underneath the land. Do they understand that kind of concept?
certainly not at present in this book. What they understood was what those relatives that had already come over wrote back these glowing letters, partly to prove that they'd made a good decision. They left out all the bad stuff and wrote back letters. This is the land of milk and honey, free land, it's yours. And a lot of that was true.
thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes.
What language was the opera?
No, the opera is in English. It was the libretto was created by another Norwegian, Sundgaard. I want to say his last name was. I don't know anything about him really, but he adapted it. It will be in English.
Getting out ahead populated by Native Americans previous. We also, the prairie is the world's most threatened ecosystem. Is there going to be any getting out ahead of the diminishing prairie and some, reference to that at all?
We're a symphony orchestra. The question was, for those who were maybe online, was since we're getting out ahead of the Native American relationship, are we getting out ahead of the ecosystem and the negative effects of what's happened on our ecosystem? And hadn't thought that there was anything that we could do with that. Happy to talk about it if there's an idea. The opera does not reference it, but it might be worth having a conversation about.
It's a good discussion point.
Yeah.
All of it is. Yes, one more. Yes.
Mine is not a question, it's a comment. My mother was a student. And then so she had two exposures to as far as literature was concerned. And so I have heard about giants in the earth that I was big enough to understand English. My father was an immigrant. He came in 1904, which was too late for this particular, for what was happening in the book. But he came with relatives who were well established in the southwestern part of Minnesota. But so much of what is written in this is old hat, as because I've heard discussing about, around the table. My daughter is a graduate of Louisiana, and so all of them feel very comfortable at home.
I would say if you read the other two books, you'll find a lot more to recognize in your family's history from 1904, like particularly the third book.
Relative his side of the family who had established wealth earlier. And my grandparents, my mother's parents, homesteaded in Lincoln County, and Grandpa had homesteaded and had built a house. He had taken an ox cart to Sioux City to get wood for the house that he built before he went back to Decorah, which was where he had met my mother when she was, no, my grandmother when she was young, and married her there and brought her. They were married in 1877, and she gave birth to 10 babies on the farm. There were no hospitals any place. And she lived to be 92 years old, and all 10 of her children were when she died at 92. I figure I have to see the
Thank you
I
for,
think your story would make for a great opera too. So there you go.
and it also reminds us that this is not that long ago. Not that long ago. All right, I think I've almost run out of time, but I wanted to make sure our panelists didn't have one more thing that they wanted to say that I didn't give them the chance to say.
I'd like to add that another partner early on in this project was South Dakota Public Broadcasting, right, who's here today. And South Dakota Public Broadcasting will film the opera, and they will have it available on their website. And we're expecting them to televise it as well. So, excellent partner and helping to make sure that this opera and the story and Ollie Rolvog can, live on, and that we're breathing some life into this music so that it can be performed and the story can, be known, beyond where we are here in South Dakota today. So thank you, SDPB, for that.
That's a great thought to end upon, but it looks like Cameron wants to say something.
Yes, I have one other thing I want to add too. At the Center for Western Studies, we're going to be doing an art exhibition on settling and resettling the plains, starting in May. So right after these other events end, that will go through the summer. It'll feature regional artists and their work, and the regional artists are able to take sort of the theme and do what they want with it. So we're also going to be doing that. So.
Please help me thank our panelists and thank you all for joining us.